Hi and welcome in the third episode of Advanced Python, in which we're going to cover Lambda functions. Lambda is a shorter way to create single expression functions, which are also called anonymous functions because they don't specifically have a name. First off, we will cover how to define Lambda functions and how to use them, and then we will go on to using Lambdas properly, meaning without assigning them to a variable. So at the start, let's create a simple function which is going to have a single expression. Let's call it chance of rain. And now let's give it parameters, which we can simply call a and b. And we want that function to return a boolean. Let's say return a plus b mod 2 is equal to 0, which is going to first off add a and b together, then try to divide them by 2 and give us the remainder, which, if the remainder is not 0, is going to print out false, and if it is 0, it will print out true. And that's how we get our boolean value. We can test it out by trying print chance of rain, and let's say 10 and 3. And this should give us false because 13 is not divisible by 2, and we get false just like we wanted to. And now let's do the same but using a lambda function instead. Let's create a variable, call it COR for chance of rain. We're going to assign to it a lambda. To assign a lambda or to use a lambda, we simply use its name as a keyword, which is lambda. First thing we want to pass into our microfunction is all of the parameters. So in our case, it's a and b, which we can add simply typing a, b. Then after you finish defining your parameters, you use a colon. And the next thing you're going to input is actually the output of the lambda function, or the return statement. But we're not using the return word itself, we're simply passing everything else. So we can try and do the same thing. A plus b mod 2 equals 0. And that is our lambda function ready. Now our COR is going to get a value assigned to it of either true or false, just like we got returned from our previous function. We can test it by calling COR and giving it the same parameters as before. And as you can see, it's false. And if I change it to 2, so it's 10 plus 2 mod 2 gives us a remainder of 0, which is going to return true. As you can see, even PyCharm is underlining our lambda and telling us to not assign a lambda expression to a variable and just use a function instead, because this isn't really how you're supposed to use lambdas. Lambdas are anonymous functions which are not really supposed to have a name which you can call. They are supposed to be mostly used as single use functions, so functions which you would use only a single time rather than referencing them constantly throughout the code. So now let's try and use a lambda without assigning it to a variable. So the first thing you have to do is you actually have to open brackets, as our lambda function has to be contained within them, and we can define it by typing lambda, passing our variables a and b, and then entering our expression, which is a plus b mod 2 equals 0, and our lambda function is complete. We didn't have to assign it to a single variable. However, now, how exactly do you pass variables or parameters into our lambda function if we're not calling it from anywhere else? We're just calling it instantly as we create it. You just have to add another set of brackets after the lambda bracket, in which we're going to pass on our parameters. So let's say 13 and 5, and if we run it, it's printing out true, because 13 plus 5 mod 2 gives you a remainder of 0, and if we would change it, as you can see, it's going to print out false. Another thing you can do with both lambda functions and regular functions is assigning default values to your parameters. So let's say we could set a to 10 and b to 2, and do the same exact thing over here. And this way, those parameters now have default values, which they're going to use if you don't pass on any values. So if I just leave this bracket empty now and I run it, you can see it prints out true. It is important, however, to actually use this bracket here, even if you're not entering any parameters, simply because without it, you're going to print the lambda object instead of actually what's contained in it. Next thing you can do is you can actually pass on functions into the lambda functions. And I'm going to show you a simple example right now. Start by importing random, creating our function, which I will simply call rand, and it will take in no parameters, and then return a random.randint of between 1 and 100. And now that we have our function, we will create a lambda function which will use it. And let's define our lambda, which will take in two values, the first one being a, the second one being b, and then we will do the same thing as previously. So check if a plus b is divisible by 2, and we are going to now actually pass on as parameters the first value, which let's say it's going to be 100, and the second value, which will be our rand function. And if I run it, as you can see, it prints out false, false again, and then it prints out true, because we're actually getting random integers from our rand function. Another thing you can do with Lambda is you can actually create little scenarios or conditionals which give you a different return based on circumstances, kind of like the false and true statements, but a little more specific. And we can do so by removing our equals 0 and then typing and, odd, or even. What it actually does now is it checks the first statement, and then depending on that statement, it chooses either odd or even. In the scenario where a plus b is divisible by 2, it gives us even, and if it is not divisible by 2, or if it is false, it gives us odd. You can customize those messages to say anything you want, and if I run it a couple times, as you can see, it prints out your personalized message. And now let's go on to using map function as well as filter function with Lambda. As I shown you in the previous episode, to map a list, you actually need to create a function, which that function then will be used to map our function. And as just now we covered lambdas, that's exactly what you can use instead of regular functions to use your mapping. So we can do that by creating a new list. Let's call it nums2, and we will set it to list map, and into our map we're going to pass on a lambda function instead of a regular one by typing lambda x. Let's say that we want to map each value in our list to the same value plus 5. So it would be x plus 5. And then the second value into our map function is going to be the numbers list. And now we can try and print our nums2. And as you can see, it prints out our list mapped to add 5 to each value contained in the list. And the last thing I would like to cover is actually the filter function, which I haven't covered before, which is used similarly to map function and is generally useful to manage lists. Just like the map function, it requires you to pass on a function and then the list which you want to operate on, but instead of mapping all of the values in it, it takes each value from the list, passes it into the function, and if the function returns true, it's going to save that value, and if it returns false, it's going to discard it, and then all of the values which returned true will be then saved into our new variable. So let's add some even values into our list, and now that we have some even values, if we run it again, you can see our list has both even and odd numbers, and we were going to use that to return true or false using our filter function. So first, let's define the function that will be actually used by it. Define even odd, which will take a parameter of x. Then we'll simply return if x is divisible by 2. Then we're going to set nums3 equal to list filter even odd and then nums2. We can now print our nums3 list, and as you can see, the only values that remained in our new list are the even values, because that's when our function returns true. And you can probably see where this is going now. We can use a lambda function, just like with the map function, or the filter function, so that we don't have to define a separate function for it. Instead of even odd, we will pass on a lambda, which takes x, and then returns if x is divisible by 2. And that's it. We're going to get exactly the same effect as previously, but it's much simpler and shorter to write. And yeah, that would be it for today. See ya.